August 15, 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 3 months, but in a sweltering dining hall at Camp Swift, Texas, a different kind of battle was about to unfold. 73 German women prisoners sat in rigid silence, staring at the plates before them with expressions that ranged from confusion to outright horror. On each white ceramic plate sat something that defied everything they understood about food. It was red, translucent, and shaped like a perfect dome. Inside this quivering mass, pieces of fruit floated in suspension like specimens in a laboratory jar. But the most disturbing aspect was that it moved. Every time someone shifted in their seat or touched the table, the substance trembled and wobbled as if it were alive. Greta Hoffmann, a 28-year-old former supply officer from Stuttgart, was the first to speak. Her voice carried across the silent hall in sharp German. "This is a test. They want to see if we're desperate enough to eat spoiled food." The other women murmured agreement, their faces reflecting the same suspicion that had kept them alive through months of uncertainty. They had been told that American captors would be cruel, that starvation and abuse awaited anyone unfortunate enough to be captured. Yet since their arrival 6 weeks earlier, they had encountered something far more unsettling than cruelty. They had encountered abundance. Cook Sergeant William Harper stood at the entrance to the kitchen, watching the scene unfold with growing bewilderment. He had spent the morning preparing what he considered a special treat for the prisoners, something light and refreshing to combat the brutal Texas heat. Cherry Jello salad with canned fruit cocktail was a staple at every church potluck and family gathering he'd ever attended. His own mother made it for every holiday. To him, it represented the best of American hospitality, a sweet gesture of goodwill toward women who had been his country's enemies just months before. But the German women saw something entirely different. They saw food that moved on its own, that caught the light in unnatural ways, that seemed to contradict the basic laws of nature. In a Germany where bread had been mixed with sawdust to stretch flour supplies, where a single egg was a luxury to be treasured, the concept of food created purely for novelty and sweetness was incomprehensible. Several of the younger women had tears in their eyes, whether from fear, confusion, or the crushing realization of how little they understood about their captor's world. No one could say. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, one of 3 female officers assigned to oversee the prisoners, recognized the crisis unfolding before her. She had seen the women's suspicion of American food before, their certainty that generous portions must be hiding some darker purpose. But this was different. This wasn't just suspicion. This was genuine shock at encountering something so foreign to their experience that they couldn't even categorize it. The Jello continued to quiver on 73 plates, and in its trembling surface reflected a cultural divide that no amount of military protocol had prepared anyone to bridge. July 1st, 1945. The transport truck carrying 73 German women prisoners rolled through the gates of Camp Swift just as the Texas sun reached its merciless afternoon peak. The women had traveled for 3 weeks from a processing center in New York, each mile taking them further from everything they knew and deeper into enemy territory. They sat in 2 rows along the truck bed, their gray auxiliary uniforms stained with sweat and dust, their faces carefully blank to hide the fear that churned beneath their carefully maintained military bearing. Greta Hoffmann sat near the front, her back straight despite exhaustion, her eyes taking in every detail of the camp that would become their home. She had served as a supply officer for the Wehrmacht, managing inventory and logistics for fighting units. Her training had taught her to assess resources and vulnerabilities at a glance. What she saw as they entered Camp Swift made no sense. The American guards looked well-fed, almost casual in their prosperity. The buildings were freshly painted. The grounds showed no signs of the deprivation that must surely be affecting a nation at war. Beside her, 22-year-old Ilse Brandt whispered in German, "It looks too perfect, like a stage set." The other women nodded agreement. They had all heard the same stories about American weakness, about a soft nation brought to its knees by the demands of war. The evidence before their eyes contradicted everything they had been told to expect. This disconnect created a deep unease that settled in their stomachs like a stone. The truck stopped before a long wooden barracks. As the women climbed down, their legs shaky from the long journey, they were met by Lieutenant Sarah Morrison. She stood in her crisp uniform, her brown hair pinned neatly beneath her cap, and regarded them with an expression that held neither hatred nor pity. "Welcome to Camp Swift," she said in careful, slow English. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will be given work assignments, 3 meals daily, and access to medical care." The women stared at her, most understanding only fragments of her words, but one phrase needed no translation: 3 meals daily. In Germany, even before the war's end, rations had been reduced to barely enough to sustain life. The idea of 3 meals seemed like either a cruel joke or propaganda meant to lower their guard. Greta made a mental note to warn the others not to trust American promises. Generosity from enemies was surely a trap. As they were led into the barracks, the women noticed small details that deepened their confusion. Clean mattresses on each bunk, windows with intact glass, a separate washroom with running water. Either the Americans were masters of deception, or everything they had been taught about their enemies was fundamentally wrong. That possibility was somehow more terrifying than any cruelty they might have faced. The first meal arrived 2 hours after their arrival, and with it came a revelation that would shake the foundations of everything the German women believed about America's capacity to wage war. Dinner was served in a long dining hall that could have accommodated twice their number. The tables were plain wood, worn but clean, and at each place setting sat an aluminum tray divided into sections. As the women filed in and took their seats, American soldiers began moving through the hall with large pots, ladling food onto each tray. Greta watched suspiciously as her sections filled. Mashed potatoes, smooth and white, glistening with butter. Green beans, not the withered specimens she'd learned to tolerate, but plump and properly cooked. A thick slice of meatloaf that actually smelled of beef rather than the mysterious mixtures that had passed for meat in Germany's final war years. And bread, 2 slices of it, so white and soft that it barely resembled the dense, dark loaves she had known all her life. Around her, the other women sat frozen, staring at their trays. Ilse leaned close and whispered, "This cannot be real food. Look at the portions." She was right. Each tray held more food than many of them had seen on a plate in years. In Stuttgart, Greta's family had celebrated her mother's 50th birthday with a single chicken shared among 8 people. Here, each prisoner received what would have fed a German family for 2 days. Lieutenant Morrison noticed their hesitation. She stepped forward and, through a translator who had accompanied the transport, explained that the food was safe, prepared in the same kitchen that fed American personnel. Still, the women didn't move. The cultural gap was too vast. They had been raised to believe that suffering built character, that deprivation was noble, that excess was weakness. The plates before them represented everything they had been taught to despise about American softness and waste. Finally, a young woman named Frieda Schultz, barely 19 and desperately hungry after the long journey, picked up her fork. She took a small bite of the mashed potatoes, her expression wary, as if expecting poison or some trick. Her eyes widened. The potatoes were real, rich with butter and cream, seasoned with salt that hadn't been hoarded or rationed. She took another bite, then another, and suddenly the dam broke. All around the hall, women began to eat, some with tears streaming down their faces as they tasted abundance they had forgotten existed. Greta ate slowly, methodically, her mind racing. If American prisoners of war ate like this, what did regular American soldiers receive? What did American civilians eat at home? The implications were staggering and deeply troubling. Germany had told them they were fighting against a nation on the verge of collapse. These plates told a very different story. The bread became an obsession for the German women during their first week at Camp Swift. It appeared at every meal, 2 slices per person, sometimes white, sometimes a pale yellow that the Americans called wheat bread, though it bore no resemblance to the hearty German Vollkorn Brot they had grown up with. This American bread was soft enough to compress into a dense ball with one hand. It was sweet, almost like cake. It had no crust to speak of, just a thin, pale shell that yielded to the slightest pressure. Greta found herself examining each slice as if it held secrets about the enemy's character. In Germany, bread was serious. It was dense, dark, filling, meant to sustain a person through long hours of labor. Bakers took pride in the heaviness of their loaves, in crusts that required strong teeth and determination. This American bread seemed to mock those values. It was frivolous, designed for comfort rather than sustenance, yet somehow the Americans thrived on it. During their second breakfast, Ilse attempted an experiment. She took her 2 slices of white bread and compressed them together, watching in fascination as they formed a mass barely larger than a single piece of German rye. "Look," she said to the women around her, speaking in low German, "this is what they eat, air and sugar. How do they fight wars on this?" But even as she spoke, she spread the camp's provided margarine on the bread and ate it, unable to deny how good it tasted, despite her contempt for its lack of substance. The bread sparked the first real conversations between prisoners and guards. Private Tom Anderson, a farm boy from Iowa who had been assigned to meal service, noticed the women's fascination. Through gestures and the few German words he'd picked up from other prisoners, he tried to explain about Wonder Bread, about how American companies had learned to mass-produce soft bread that stayed fresh for days. The women listened with expressions of polite incomprehension. The concept of bread designed for convenience rather than nutrition was as foreign to them as the language he spoke. But it was Cook Sergeant Harper who provided the real revelation. He brought out a loaf of what he called sourdough, made by a local baker in the nearby town of Bastrop. This bread had substance, a proper crust, a tangy complexity that reminded the women of home. Their faces lit up with recognition and relief. So Americans did know how to make real bread. They simply chose not to, most of the time. This choice, this preference for soft sweetness over hearty sustenance, troubled Greta more than she wanted to admit. It spoke of a nation so secure in its abundance that it could afford to choose pleasure over necessity. What kind of people had Germany been fighting? What kind of people had the resources to be frivolous about something as fundamental as bread? Greta Hoffman couldn't sleep on the 8th night at Camp Swift. While the other women in her barracks surrendered to exhaustion, she lay on her bunk staring at the ceiling, her mind working through calculations that didn't add up. She had served as a supply officer long enough to understand logistics, to know what it took to feed an army. The numbers she was witnessing at this small prisoner of war camp defied everything she had learned about wartime resource management. Each morning, fresh eggs appeared in the kitchen, not the powdered substitute that German soldiers had learned to tolerate, but actual eggs with yolks that ran golden when broken. The camp received daily deliveries of milk in glass bottles, cream that hadn't been watered down, butter in quantities that would have supplied a German battalion for a week. And the bread, that infuriating soft bread, arrived twice weekly in trucks that seemed to carry nothing but carbohydrates, destined for prisoners who had been Germany's enemies mere months ago. She had tried to discuss her observations with Ilse, but the younger woman had brushed off her concerns. "Maybe we should just be grateful, Greta. Maybe the war is really over and we should stop looking for conspiracies." But Greta couldn't stop. Her training wouldn't allow it. There had to be an explanation for this abundance that made sense within the framework of what she understood about warfare and national resources. During the day, she watched the American guards carefully, looking for signs of the deprivation that must exist somewhere in this equation. Surely, if prisoners ate this well, the guards must be suffering. But Private Anderson looked healthy, even plump. Sergeant Harper hummed while he cooked, showing none of the stress that came with managing scarce resources. Lieutenant Morrison's uniform was well maintained, her boots unpatched, her bearing that of someone who had never known true hunger. One afternoon, Greta volunteered for kitchen duty, hoping to find answers. She worked alongside Corporal Rita Williams, a cheerful black woman from Georgia who seemed delighted to have help. As they peeled potatoes together, Greta carefully asked through gestures and broken English about food supplies. Corporal Williams laughed and explained, as best she could across the language barrier, that this was nothing special. This was just normal food, the same rations that fed American soldiers everywhere, the same quality that many American families ate at home. The revelation hit Greta like a physical blow. If this was normal, if this abundance wasn't special treatment designed to break their spirits, but simply how Americans lived, then everything she had believed about the war's trajectory had been a lie. Germany hadn't been fighting against a nation brought low by conflict. They had been fighting against a giant that barely noticed the burden of war on its dinner table. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning during the third week of August, and it started with something as simple as a cup of coffee. Greta had been assigned to help clean the administrative offices, a task she approached with her usual efficiency and silent observation. As she worked, Lieutenant Morrison sat at her desk reviewing paperwork, occasionally glancing up to ensure the prisoner was staying within approved areas. The morning stretched on, and Morrison reached for her thermos, pouring herself a cup of coffee. The rich aroma filled the small office. Greta paused in her dusting, her attention captured by the smell. Real coffee had become a distant memory in Germany. For the last 2 years of the war, civilians had made do with ersatz coffee made from roasted barley or chicory root, a bitter brown liquid that bore only the faintest resemblance to the genuine article. The scent from Morrison's thermos spoke of authentic coffee beans, strong and fragrant. Morrison noticed Greta's expression. Without a word, she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a second cup. She poured coffee into it, added sugar from a small bowl on her desk, and held it out to the German prisoner. Greta stared at the offering, uncertain. Was this a test, a trick? But Morrison's face showed only simple kindness, the kind of casual generosity that comes from abundance rather than calculation. Greta accepted the cup with a quiet "Danke," one of the few German words Morrison had learned. The coffee was hot, sweet, and real. As she drank, something shifted inside her chest, a tightness she hadn't even known was there, beginning to loosen. This wasn't rations being distributed according to regulation. This was one woman sharing her coffee with another because she had extra and saw no reason not to. Similar moments began occurring throughout the camp. Private Anderson taught some of the younger prisoners how to play American card games during their recreation time, patiently explaining rules through gestures and laughter when words failed. Corporal Williams braided Ilse's hair one afternoon when she noticed the young woman struggling with her long blonde locks in the Texas heat, creating an intricate pattern that kept the hair off her neck and made her look less like a prisoner and more like a person. Sergeant Harper started asking the German women about their food preferences, genuinely curious about what they missed from home. When they mentioned pretzels, he spent his next day off learning how to make them, presenting his lumpy, imperfect attempts to the prisoners with a sheepish grin. The pretzels weren't quite right, too soft and lacking the proper dark crust. But the women ate them with tears in their eyes because someone had tried. Someone had listened to what they missed and attempted to give it back to them. These small kindnesses accumulated like drops of water wearing away stone. The women began to smile more, to meet the guard's eyes instead of staring at the ground. Conversations in broken English and pidgin German started to replace suspicious silence. The camp was slowly transforming from a place of captivity into something neither side had expected, a space where former enemies were learning to see each other as simply human. By the beginning of September, 12 German women had volunteered for permanent kitchen duty. What had started as mandatory work assignments had become something the prisoners actively sought. The kitchen represented a world of abundance that fascinated them, a daily education in American prosperity that contradicted everything they thought they knew about their former enemies. Greta was among the volunteers, drawn by a need to understand the systems that produced such plenty. The kitchen itself was larger than necessary for the camp's population, equipped with industrial stoves, multiple ovens, and storage areas that seemed to replenish themselves with magical regularity. Sergeant Harper ran his domain with relaxed efficiency, treating the German volunteers more like apprentices than prisoners. He taught them American cooking techniques, showed them how to use unfamiliar ingredients, and seemed genuinely pleased when they picked up new skills quickly. What amazed the women most was the variety. In Germany, wartime cooking had become an exercise in making the same few ingredients palatable through different preparations. Potatoes, cabbage, turnips, and whatever grain could be obtained formed the foundation of nearly every meal. Meat appeared rarely, and when it did, its origin was often questionable. But Sergeant Harper's kitchen received weekly deliveries that looked like they came from fantasy rather than reality. Canned goods arrived in staggering quantities: peaches, pears, fruit cocktail, green beans, corn, tomatoes, each can bearing colorful labels that promised consistent quality and flavor. The women had seen canned goods before, but never in such abundance or variety. Frida Schultz spent an entire afternoon organizing the canned fruit, arranging the labels so she could read each one, marveling at the idea of peaches available in December or strawberries in March. Fresh produce arrived twice weekly from local farms. Even in September, with summer fading, the deliveries included lettuce, tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, and squash. The women learned that Texas's climate allowed for longer growing seasons than Germany's, but that didn't fully explain the abundance. There was also infrastructure, distribution systems that could move food from farm to table with minimal loss, refrigeration that prevented spoilage, and most importantly, an agricultural system that hadn't been bombed or depleted by years of total war. Ilsa discovered her talent for baking while working in the kitchen. Sergeant Harper taught her to make American-style cakes, fluffy confections, so different from the dense tortas she knew from home. The first time she successfully made a yellow layer cake with chocolate frosting, Harper praised her work genuinely. She found herself smiling, feeling pride in creation rather than destruction for the first time in years. The kitchen volunteers began to bridge two worlds. They taught Harper and his staff how to make German dishes like Kartoffelpuffer and Spätzle, adapting recipes to use American ingredients. In return, they learned about casseroles, pot roasts, and the mysterious art of making biscuits light enough to pull apart in layers. Food became a language that required no translation, a way of sharing culture that transcended the recent past of violence and hatred. The letters arrived in October, distributed by Lieutenant Morrison during an evening assembly. 27 of the 73 women received mail that had been processed through the International Red Cross, forwarded from addresses that might no longer exist to prisoners in a Texas camp. The women clutched their envelopes with trembling hands, afraid of what news they might contain, but desperate for any connection to the lives they had left behind. Greta's letter came from her younger sister, Margaret, writing from a displaced persons camp outside Munich. The paper was thin, rationed, and Margaret's handwriting showed the shakiness of someone not getting enough food. She wrote about the destruction of Stuttgart, how their family home had been reduced to rubble during an Allied bombing raid in February. Their mother had survived but was living with strangers in a partially destroyed apartment building. Their father hadn't been heard from since his unit surrendered to Soviet forces. Margaret herself had walked nearly 200 kilometers to reach the American zone, believing it offered better chances for survival. The letter went on to describe conditions that made Greta's hands shake as she read. Food rations in occupied Germany provided barely 1,200 calories per day, not enough for adults doing physical labor. The black market thrived, but prices were astronomical. A single egg cost more than a week's wages. Margaret wrote matter-of-factly about eating potato peels and being grateful for them, about friends who had died from starvation or disease in the chaotic months after the war's end. Around the barracks, other women read similar accounts. Ilse learned that her entire neighborhood in Berlin had been leveled. Her mother was alive but working in rubble clearing for extra rations. Her brother, only 14, was missing, likely dead. Frida discovered that her hometown of Dresden no longer existed as she remembered it, the city having been destroyed in the firebombing she had heard about even before her capture. The contrast between what they read and what they lived became unbearable. That evening, the women had eaten pot roast with carrots and potatoes, followed by apple pie made with canned filling. Their bellies were full. They slept on mattresses with clean sheets. They had received medical care when sick, had access to soap and hot water, had been treated with a baseline dignity that their own families apparently lacked in. Defeated Germany. The guilt was crushing. Greta sat on her bunk long after lights out, Margaret's letter clutched in her hand. How could she tell her starving sister that she, a prisoner of war, ate better than most German civilians? How could she explain that the enemies who had destroyed their city now fed her 3 meals daily and taught her to make American cakes? The moral complexity of her situation threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. Several women wept openly that night. Others sat in stunned silence. The letters had accomplished what months of propaganda never could. They made real the cost of the war Germany had lost, forced the prisoners to confront the gap between the nationalist fantasies they had been fed and the devastating reality their families now endured. Sergeant Harper decided that the second week of October would be perfect for introducing the German prisoners to one of America's most beloved culinary innovations. He had noticed how the women were finally beginning to relax around American food, no longer examining every dish with suspicion before eating. They had adapted to soft bread, had learned to appreciate casseroles, and had even begun requesting certain American dishes they particularly enjoyed. He felt the time was right for Jello. He began preparations on a Tuesday morning, pulling out boxes of cherry-flavored gelatin powder from the storage room. The boxes themselves were works of American marketing art, bright red with cheerful lettering, promising easy preparation and delicious results. Greta, working in the kitchen that morning, watched him with curiosity as he boiled water and stirred in the crimson powder until it dissolved completely. Harper explained his plan through a combination of English and gestures. He would make individual Jello salads for each prisoner, adding canned fruit cocktail for color and nutrition. He showed Greta the can, pointing out the various fruits suspended in syrup, maraschino cherries, peaches, pears, and grapes. She nodded, understanding the general concept. He was making some kind of fruit dessert. Nothing about the process seemed particularly unusual. The trouble began when Harper poured the liquid gelatin mixture into individual molds and added the fruit. Greta watched the pieces of fruit sink into the red liquid, floating at various depths like specimens in a biology jar. Harper seemed pleased with this effect, explaining something about how pretty it would look when set. He placed the molds in the refrigerator and told Greta they would serve them at dinner the following day, giving them 24 hours to properly gel. The next evening, Harper retrieved the molds with obvious pride. He had made 73 individual servings, each one a perfect dome of translucent red gelatin with colorful fruit pieces suspended throughout. He carefully unmolded each one onto a white plate, creating rows of identical wobbling desserts that caught the light in ways that made them seem to glow. When it was time to serve dinner, Harper decided to present the Jello salads as a special course after the main meal of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. The American staff carried the plates into the dining hall, setting one before each German prisoner with ceremony befitting a special treat. Harper stood at the kitchen entrance, eager to see the women's reactions to this quintessentially American dish. What he witnessed instead was confusion turning rapidly to alarm. The women stared at their plates with expressions he couldn't immediately interpret. Several leaned closer to examine the wobbling red substance. One prisoner, a young woman named Helga, accidentally bumped her table, causing her Jello to tremble noticeably. She gasped and pulled back as if it might attack her. Around the hall, other women noticed the movement, and similar reactions rippled through the group. The dining hall had fallen into an eerie silence, broken only by the scraping of chairs as several prisoners pushed back from their tables, putting distance between themselves and the quivering red substances on their plates. Lieutenant Morrison, observing from her usual position near the door, initially thought there had been some kind of contamination. She approached the nearest table where Greta sat frozen, her eyes fixed on the Jello with an expression of profound distrust. "Is something wrong?" Morrison asked, then realized the absurdity of the question. Clearly, something was very wrong. Around the hall, 73 women were regarding their dessert plates as if they contained live grenades. Morrison picked up one of the plates and examined it herself. The Jello looked perfectly normal to her eyes, a standard cherry gelatin salad with fruit cocktail, the kind of thing her own mother made for every church social and family gathering. She set the plate down, and the Jello wobbled dramatically. Several nearby prisoners gasped. Morrison suddenly understood. These women had never seen gelatin before. They had no cultural context for food that moved independently, that jiggled and shook with a life of its own. What seemed wholesome and nostalgic to her appeared alien and possibly dangerous to them. Greta finally found her voice, speaking in German to the women around her. "It's moving. Food should not move unless it's alive or spoiled." Ilse nodded agreement, her face pale. "Perhaps it's some kind of test, to see if we're desperate enough to eat anything." Frida, always the most anxious of the group, whispered that maybe it was a new kind of poison, something that looked harmless but would make them sick. The conversation spread through the hall in rapid German, each woman adding her own theory about the suspicious dessert. Some thought it might be a practical joke, a way for the Americans to mock their prisoners. Others believed it was some kind of scientific experiment, testing how enemy soldiers would react to unfamiliar substances. A few wondered if this was how Americans normally ate, if perhaps their entire food culture was built on things that violated natural laws. Sergeant Harper emerged from the kitchen, his face showing confusion at the lack of enthusiasm. He had expected delight, or at least curiosity. Instead, he faced what looked like a dining hall full of people, convinced he had tried to poison them. He picked up one of the Jello molds and held it up, trying to demonstrate through exaggerated gestures that it was safe, edible, even delicious. He took a spoon and scooped a large portion into his mouth, chewing the gelatin and fruit with obvious pleasure. "Cease," he said, even though most of the women couldn't understand his words. "It's good. It's just Jello. Cherry Jello with fruit." He took another bite, then another, finishing the entire serving while the German women watched with expressions of mingled fascination and horror. Private Anderson, catching on to Harper's demonstration, also took a plate and began eating. Then Corporal Williams joined in. Soon half a dozen American staff members were eating Jello salads, trying to prove through their own consumption that the food was safe. But the cultural gap was too vast. The German women saw Americans eating something that moved like a living creature, and instead of reassuring them, it only deepened the mystery of these strange people who had defeated their nation. The standoff over the Jello salads continued for nearly 20 minutes, with American staff eating their portions while German prisoners watched in stubborn refusal. Lieutenant Morrison realized that force would only deepen the women's suspicions. She needed a volunteer, someone trusted by the other prisoners who would be willing to take the risk of tasting the mysterious, wobbling substance. Her eyes settled on Greta, who had become an informal leader among the women and whose practical nature might overcome superstition. Morrison approached Greta's table with a fresh plate of Jello, sitting down across from her as an equal rather than standing over her as a superior. Through the camp's translator, who had been summoned from his evening duties, she began to explain. "This is called Jello. It's made from gelatin. which comes from animal bones and connective tissue. When mixed with hot water and then cooled, it creates this texture. It's not alive, it's not spoiled, it's intentionally made to be this way. Greta listened carefully, her analytical mind working through the explanation. She understood animal-based products. Germans made their own version of aspic, a savory gelatin made from meat stocks that was served at special occasions. But that was clear or brown, meant to preserve meat and vegetables, and it certainly never came in bright red with perfect transparent clarity. This American version seemed designed purely for sweetness and novelty, which struck her as fundamentally frivolous. Still, she trusted Morrison more than she had trusted any American at the start of her captivity. The lieutenant had been fair, had shown genuine concern for the prisoners' welfare, and had never lied to them about anything. If Morrison said the food was safe, it probably was. Greta picked up her spoon, aware that every eye in the dining hall was now fixed on her. She carefully scooped a small amount of the Jello, making sure to include one of the suspended fruit pieces. The texture was unlike anything she had experienced. Cool, slippery, neither liquid nor solid, but something in between. It required almost no chewing, simply dissolving against her tongue. The flavor was intensely sweet, artificially cherry in a way that bore only passing resemblance to actual cherries. The fruit cocktail piece provided a contrasting texture, soft and syrup-soaked. She swallowed and waited, half expecting some adverse reaction. Nothing happened. No burning sensation, no immediate nausea, no sign of poison or contamination. It was simply food, strange food, that violated her expectations about proper texture and substance, but food nonetheless. She took another bite, then another. Around her, the other women watched with desperate attention, waiting for her verdict. Es ist sicher, Greta finally said in German. It's safe. Then, struggling for honesty, she added, Es ist süß, sehr süß, und seltsam. It's sweet, very sweet, and strange. This qualified endorsement was enough. If Greta, with her careful, suspicious nature, declared the Jello safe, then it must be. One by one, other prisoners picked up their spoons and began to taste. The reactions varied wildly. Some women loved the intense sweetness, a pleasure that had been absent from their lives for years. Others found the texture disturbing, struggling with food that seemed to resist the normal rules of chewing and swallowing. Ilse laughed unexpectedly after her first bite, the absurdity of the situation suddenly overwhelming her resistance. We survived a war, she said in German, and this is what defeats us. Wiggling food. The Jello incident became a turning point in ways that Sergeant Harper never intended when he decided to introduce the prisoners to American dessert culture. Over the following days, the wobbling red substance sparked more conversations between guards and prisoners than any official integration program could have achieved. The German women wanted to understand not just what Jello was, but why it existed, what it said about the American character, and how a nation could wage war while developing frivolous foods. Greta found herself in Harper's office 3 days after the infamous dinner, ostensibly to discuss kitchen schedules, but actually driven by questions she couldn't suppress. Through the translator, she asked about American food culture, with the systematic thoroughness of someone conducting an intelligence assessment. Harper, delighted by her genuine curiosity, pulled out cookbooks and women's magazines, showing her the vast array of Jello-based recipes that populated American cuisine. There were Jello molds shaped like rings, stars, and elaborate architectural structures. There were recipes for Jello with vegetables, Jello with mayonnaise, Jello layered in rainbow colors. One magazine featured a recipe for tomato soup, Jello served as a salad course. Greta stared at the images with frank disbelief. "You make food look like this on purpose?" she asked through the translator. "This is considered normal?" Harper tried to explain about American abundance leading to creativity, about housewives competing to create the most impressive dishes for social gatherings, about food companies marketing convenience products that promise to make any cook look sophisticated. But his explanations only deepened Greta's confusion. In Germany, Food was serious, functional, meant to nourish bodies for work. The idea of food as entertainment, as a medium for artistic expression and social competition, came from a mindset shaped by security and plenty. The conversation expanded beyond Jello to encompass broader patterns Greta had observed. The excessive packaging, with every item wrapped in paper or cardboard printed with colorful designs. The variety, with dozens of brands competing to sell essentially identical products. The waste, as Americans threw away food that Germans would have treasured. The casual attitude toward meals, eating quickly without ceremony, treating food as fuel rather than as something to be savored. Harper found himself defending American food culture while simultaneously seeing it through foreign eyes for the first time. He had never questioned why Jello existed, why Americans felt the need to make food wobble and shine, why convenience mattered more than tradition. Talking with Greta forced him to recognize patterns he had always taken for granted. Americans valued innovation, novelty, and ease. They had the luxury of making food fun because they had never known true hunger. The discussion drew in other prisoners and guards. Ilsa wanted to know about other American convenience foods, leading to demonstrations of canned cream of mushroom soup, instant pudding, and the mysterious product called Spam. Each new revelation prompted debates among the German women about whether these innovations represented progress or decline, efficiency or laziness, abundance or cultural emptiness. Corporal Williams contributed her own perspective as a black woman from the South, explaining how different American communities had different food traditions, how poverty and wealth created distinct cuisines even within the same country. The German women were surprised to learn that not all Americans ate the same way, that the abundance they witnessed in the camp didn't extend equally to all citizens. By late October, the camp kitchen had become a genuine cultural exchange center, though one that would never appear in any official military reports. The German women no longer simply followed instructions from American cooks. They had begun asserting their own culinary knowledge, teaching recipes that had been passed down through generations, adapting traditional dishes to work with the ingredients available in a Texas prisoner of war camp. The transformation happened gradually, emerging from small suggestions that grew into collaborative cooking sessions. It started when Greta mentioned to Sergeant Harper that the potatoes served at dinner could be made more interesting. Through the translator, she described Kartoffelpuffer, the crispy potato pancakes that had been a staple of her childhood. Harper, always eager to expand his repertoire, asked her to demonstrate. The next morning, Greta stood at the stove with Harper beside her, showing him how to grate potatoes, squeeze out excess moisture, mix in eggs and flour, and fry the mixture until golden and crisp. The Kartoffelpuffer were served at lunch that day, and the reaction from the German prisoners was immediate and emotional. Several women had tears in their eyes as they tasted something that connected them to homes that might no longer exist. The food carried memories, grandmother's kitchens, holiday celebrations, ordinary Tuesday evenings when families gathered around tables that had since been destroyed by bombs or abandoned in flight. Encouraged by this success, other prisoners began sharing their knowledge. Ilsa taught the kitchen staff how to make spätzle, the small egg noodles that could be served with gravy or cheese. The process was labor-intensive, requiring the dough to be pressed through a colander into boiling water, but several American soldiers volunteered to help, fascinated by the technique. Frida contributed a recipe for Apfelstrudel, though she had to adapt it significantly since the camp lacked the thin pastry dough traditionally used. Her American version, made with pie crust, wasn't quite right, but it was close enough to evoke homesickness and comfort in equal measure. The cultural exchange flowed both directions. Harper taught the German women how to make proper Southern biscuits, a skill that required a light touch and cold butter. Corporal Williams showed them her grandmother's method for frying chicken, a technique that involved buttermilk marinade and a carefully seasoned flour coating. Private Anderson shared his mother's recipe for corn casserole, a sweet and savory dish that the German women initially regarded with suspicion, but eventually came to enjoy. Language barriers dissolved in the kitchen. Cooking required demonstration more than explanation, and success could be tasted rather than described. Women who struggled with English grammar had no trouble following Harper's gestures as he showed them how to knead biscuit dough. Americans who couldn't pronounce German words correctly could still appreciate the result when Greta pulled a perfect potato pancake from the fryer. The shared cooking sessions created relationships that transcended the prisoner guard dynamic. When Ilse burned her hand on a hot pan, it was Private Anderson who grabbed her wrist and thrust it under cold running water, holding it there while speaking soothing words she couldn't understand, but whose meaning was clear. When Harper struggled to get his strudel dough thin enough, Frida gently took over, her experienced hands working the dough with a skill born from years of practice, teaching him through touch what words could never convey. Food became the language that needed no translation, creating bonds between people who had been enemies months before. November brought news that shattered what remained of the German prisoners' ideological certainties. The camp received newspapers and magazines more regularly now, and Lieutenant Morrison had established a small library where prisoners could read under supervision. The American publications carried detailed reports and photographs from the liberated concentration camps, evidence that had been presented at the war crimes trials beginning in Nuremberg. The images were grainy but clear enough. Piles of emaciated bodies, survivors who looked like animated skeletons, gas chambers disguised as showers. Greta sat in the library on a cold November morning, reading a Life magazine article about Bergen-Belsen with mounting horror. The photographs showed things she couldn't reconcile with the Germany she thought she knew. These weren't military casualties from combat. These were civilians, including children, who had been systematically starved and murdered. The article included testimony from SS guards who described the operations with bureaucratic detachment, as if they had been managing a factory rather than exterminating human beings. Around her, other women read similar accounts in different publications. The camp had received a package of German-language newspapers printed in the American occupation zone, specifically intended for prisoner of war camps. These publications didn't soften the truth. If anything, they were more direct, written in the prisoner's native language to ensure there could be no misunderstanding based on translation errors or cultural confusion. Ilse found an article about Dachau, located not far from her hometown. She had lived within 50 kilometers of that camp for years, had sometimes seen trains passing through with sealed cars, had heard rumors that she had dismissed as enemy propaganda or exaggeration. The article detailed what American soldiers found when they liberated the camp, the crematorium ovens still containing remains, the medical experimentation facilities, the systematic documentation of atrocities kept with characteristic German thoroughness. The women gathered in small groups, sharing what they had read, trying to process information that upended their understanding of what they had been serving. Frida, who had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps believing she was helping defend her country from invasion, read about Auschwitz with shaking hands. The scale of the killing described in the articles was incomprehensible. Industrial murder, organized with the same efficiency that Germans applied to manufacturing automobiles or precision instruments. "How did we not know?" Ilse asked in German, her voice barely above a whisper. "I lived there. I lived in Germany while this was happening. How could I not know?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable and devastating. Some of the women insisted they had truly been ignorant, that information had been carefully controlled by the regime. Others admitted they had heard rumors but dismissed them as impossible exaggerations. A few confessed they had suspected something terrible was happening but had been too afraid to ask questions. Greta felt the foundation of her identity cracking. She had been proud of German efficiency, German organization, German discipline. Now she understood that these same qualities had been applied to genocide. The meticulous record-keeping she had practiced as a supply officer was the same mentality that had documented each murder, each piece of confiscated property, each person loaded onto trains destined for death camps. Her skills, her training, her values had all been in service of something monstrous. That evening, several women couldn't eat dinner. The pot roast and mashed potatoes that had once seemed like proof of American abundance now felt like an accusation. How could they sit here, being fed 3 meals daily by the people whose civilians their country had murdered? How could they accept kindness from Corporal Williams, when Black Americans had been listed among the Untermensch in Nazi ideology? How could they make friendly conversation with Private Anderson when his Jewish surname suggested he belonged to the people Germany had tried to exterminate? The third week of November brought an announcement that caused confusion among the German prisoners. Sergeant Harper gathered the kitchen volunteers to explain that a major American holiday was approaching, one that would require extensive preparation and cooking. Through the translator, he described Thanksgiving as a day of gratitude and feasting, when families gathered to share an elaborate meal centered on roasted turkey, stuffing, and numerous side dishes. The camp would observe the holiday with a special dinner for all personnel, including prisoners. The timing felt wrong to Greta. The German women were still reeling from the concentration camp revelations, still processing their complicity in atrocities they claimed not to have known about. The idea of celebrating anything seemed obscene, yet Harper was enthusiastic about the upcoming feast, already planning the menu, calculating how many turkeys he would need to feed everyone, deciding which traditional dishes to include. "I don't understand," Greta said through the translator. "Why would you include us in your celebration? We were your enemies. Our country did terrible things." Harper paused in his planning, considering her question seriously. "Thanksgiving isn't about who deserves to celebrate," he finally replied. "It's about being grateful for what we have and sharing it with others. You're here now. You're part of this community. That's enough." His answer didn't resolve Greta's moral confusion, but it exemplified something she had been observing about American character. They seemed able to hold contradictory ideas simultaneously, to condemn Nazi atrocities while treating individual Germans with kindness, to remember recent enmity while extending current friendship. This flexibility, this refusal to reduce people to simple categories of good or evil, was fundamentally different from the rigid ideological thinking she had been raised with. The Thanksgiving preparation became an unexpected form of therapy for the German women. The focus on cooking, on practical tasks with visible results, provided relief from the psychological burden of their recent discoveries. Ilse volunteered to help make pies, learning the difference between pumpkin, apple, and pecan varieties. Frida took charge of preparing vegetables, peeling what seemed like mountains of potatoes and sweet potatoes. Even women who hadn't previously worked in the kitchen asked to help, needing something productive to do with their hands and minds. Harper taught them about American Thanksgiving traditions, the mythology of pilgrims and Native Americans sharing a harvest feast, the evolution of the holiday into a national celebration of abundance and family. The women listened with interest, noting how Americans created meaning through stories that emphasized cooperation and gratitude rather than martial glory or national superiority. The holiday's focus on thankfulness rather than triumph seemed characteristic of a nation that had never known invasion, that took its prosperity for granted enough to dedicate a day to acknowledging it. As the preparation continued, Lieutenant Morrison explained another aspect of the holiday. Thanksgiving was when Americans traditionally helped those less fortunate, donating food to the poor, volunteering at churches and community centers. This year, several local families had contacted the camp asking if they could contribute to the prisoners' Thanksgiving dinner, wanting to extend hospitality to enemy soldiers who were far from home. The gesture moved several women to tears. Americans whose cities hadn't been bombed wanted to share their abundance with Germans whose country had tried to conquer the world. the irony wasn't lost on anyone. Germans were being fed by the people they had tried to destroy, welcomed to a celebration of gratitude by those who had every reason to be unforgiving. Thanksgiving Day arrived cold and clear, the Texas sky a brilliant blue that reminded the German women of autumn days in their homeland. The camp kitchen had been working since dawn, filling the air with aromas that transcended language, nationality. Roasting turkey, sage and onion stuffing, sweet potatoes with brown sugar and butter, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce, both jellied and whole berry, and an array of pies cooling on every available surface. The scents represented abundance on a scale that still seemed impossible to the prisoners. The dining hall had been transformed for the occasion. American staff had brought in decorations, autumn leaves and small pumpkins arranged on the tables, handmade signs expressing gratitude and welcome. The usual separate seating for guards and prisoners had been abandoned. Instead, tables were arranged to mix Americans and Germans, forcing interaction and shared space. Lieutenant Morrison had insisted on this arrangement, believing that breaking bread together at a holiday meal might accomplish what months of official policy could not. At noon, everyone gathered in the dining hall. Sergeant Harper stood to explain the tradition of saying what one was thankful for before the meal began. He went first, expressing gratitude for good health, for the war's end, for the opportunity to serve and cook. Other Americans followed, their statements ranging from simple appreciation for family and friends to more profound thanks for survival and peace. Then Harper invited the German prisoners to participate if they wished. The room fell silent, uncertain. Finally, Greta stood, her English now confident enough for this moment. "I am thankful," she said slowly, choosing each word carefully, "for truth. Even when truth is painful, even when it shows we were wrong about everything, truth is better than the lies we believed." Her voice caught slightly, but she continued, "And I am thankful for kindness from people who had no reason to be kind." Other German women began to speak, some in halting English, others in German with quick translation. Ilse gave thanks for letters from home, for knowing her mother still lived. Frida expressed gratitude for second chances, for the possibility that people could change and grow. Each statement carried weight, acknowledging, without explicitly naming the moral reckoning they were all experiencing. The meal itself was extraordinary. The turkeys emerged from the ovens golden and glistening, carved by Harper and his staff into generous portions. The side dishes appeared in serving bowls that seemed bottomless, constantly refilled. The women who had helped prepare the food felt pride in their contribution, pointing out to their tablemates which dishes they had helped make. Private Anderson sat beside Ilse, teaching her the American custom of combining cranberry sauce with turkey. Corporal Williams showed Frida how to build the perfect bite with a little of everything on the fork. Conversation flowed more easily than anyone had anticipated. Americans asked about German holiday traditions, learning about Christmas markets and Easter celebrations. Germans inquired about American regional differences, discovering that Thanksgiving traditions varied between North and South, urban and rural areas. The shared meal created a temporary suspension of the prisoner-guard dynamic, allowing people to simply be people enjoying food together. The pies arrived as the main course concluded. Pumpkin, apple, pecan, and cherry, each served with whipped cream that several German women had helped make, learning the peculiar skill of whipping cream to soft peaks without overbeating. The sweetness was almost overwhelming after years of sugar scarcity, but no one complained. Dessert represented pure indulgence, pleasure without nutritional justification, exactly the kind of frivolity that Americans seem to embrace without guilt. December brought the announcement the German women had been both expecting and dreading. Repatriation procedures were beginning for all remaining prisoners of war in American camps. Transportation to Germany would be arranged through military channels, with prisoners processed through displaced persons facilities in Europe before being released to return to whatever remained of their homes. Lieutenant Morrison called a general assembly to explain the timeline and procedures, her voice professionally neutral as she outlined what should have been welcome news of freedom and return. The 73 women sat in the dining hall where they had shared so many meals, where they had learned about Jello and Thanksgiving, where enemies had gradually become something closer to friends. Morrison explained that they would have 2 weeks to prepare, that they could send letters ahead to family members if addresses were known, that the Red Cross would assist in reunification efforts. Everything was organized, efficient, exactly what one would expect from American military planning. But as Morrison spoke, several women exchanged glances that carried complex emotions. Greta felt her stomach tighten with anxiety that had nothing to do with the journey itself. She thought about her sister's letters describing starvation conditions in occupied Germany, about cities reduced to rubble, about a society that would view returning prisoners with suspicion and contempt. She thought about the moral weight of going back to help rebuild versus the equally valid desire to escape the crushing guilt of association with atrocities. After the assembly, the women gathered in small groups throughout the compound, speaking in urgent German about decisions that suddenly felt impossible. Ilse voiced what many were thinking. What are we going back to? My mother is alive, thank God, but living in a destroyed city with barely enough food to survive. Here, even as prisoners, we eat better than German civilians. How do I go back and watch her starve while remembering the abundance here? Frida raised another concern. They'll hate us for being captured, for surviving while others died, for being corrupted by American influence. We won't be welcome as heroes. We'll be reminders of defeat and shame. The observation was harsh but accurate. German society would need scapegoats for its catastrophic losses, and returning prisoners of war would serve that purpose conveniently. But Greta articulated the deepest fear. I've changed here. I've learned things about our country, about myself, that I can never unlearn. I don't know if I can go back and pretend to be the person I was before. That person believed lies. That person served evil without knowing it. How do I live in Germany knowing what I know now? The question resonated with women who had undergone genuine transformation during their captivity. Over the following days, a smaller group began meeting separately. 22 women, including Greta, Ilse, and Frida, started discussing an option that seemed both cowardly and brave. What if they didn't return immediately? What if they asked to stay, to be processed as displaced persons rather than repatriated prisoners? The American military had procedures for such cases, though they were rarely used. The women could potentially remain in America, finding work and building new lives far from the rubble and recrimination awaiting them in Germany. The discussions were agonizing. Some women felt a duty to return and help rebuild, arguing that Germany needed people who had learned different values, who could contribute to creating a better nation. Others couldn't face returning to a place where they would be forever marked by their service to a regime now revealed as monstrous. 20 years later, on a warm spring afternoon in 1965, Greta Hoffman stood in the kitchen of her small house in Austin, Texas, preparing Jello salad for a neighborhood potluck. Her hands moved with practiced ease, dissolving the cherry gelatin powder in boiling water, adding cold water and canned fruit cocktail, pouring the mixture into a decorative mold. The process that had once seemed so alien now felt completely natural, just another part of her American life. She had been one of 18 women who ultimately chose to remain in the United States rather than accept immediate repatriation. The process had been complicated, requiring legal navigation of displaced person status, sponsorship from local families, and employment that would support them without taking jobs from American citizens. The Henderson family, the same people who had befriended Ingrid in the competitor's story, had helped Greta establish herself, initially housing her and later helping her find work as a translator for international businesses in Austin. Her path hadn't been easy. There had been hostility from some Americans who questioned why enemy soldiers deserved special consideration. There had been loneliness and cultural confusion, moments when she wondered if she had made the right choice. But there had also been opportunities impossible in post-war Germany. She had attended university courses, something her family's economic status would never have permitted in Germany. She had built a career using language skills developed during captivity. She had married an American veteran, a man who had fought against Germany but could separate the nation's crimes from individual people's worth. Ilse had settled in Chicago, working as a nurse at a hospital that served immigrant communities. She wrote letters to Greta regularly, describing how her experience as a prisoner of war had taught her to see suffering as universal rather than national. Frida had moved to California, married a fellow German immigrant, and opened a bakery that specialized in both German and American baked goods, literally making her living from the cultural fusion she had discovered at Camp Swift. The 55 women who had chosen immediate repatriation had taken different paths. Some had written to Greta over the years, describing the difficulties of rebuilding lives in divided Germany, but also the satisfaction of contributing to their country's transformation. Several had become teachers, social workers, and community leaders, using what they had learned about democracy and human dignity during their American captivity to shape a new German generation. As Greta placed her Jello mold in the refrigerator to set, she thought about that first encounter with wiggling food that had seemed so threatening. The Jello had been more than just dessert. It had been a symbol of everything she hadn't understood about America: abundance without apology, frivolity as a form of freedom, the luxury of making food beautiful simply because you could. Learning to accept and even enjoy Jello had been part of learning to accept a fundamentally different way of seeing the world.